somewhere in rural England, 1312. A woman lifts the lid off a clay pot. Steam rolls out thick, gray, and heavy. Inside is a porridge made from boiled oats, water, and nothing else. No salt, no butter, no seasoning of any kind. She ladles it into a wooden bowl and sets it in front of her husband. He eats without speaking. There is nothing to say. This is what they ate yesterday. It is what they will eat tomorrow. It is what their parents ate and their parents before them. Outside, a nobleman's kitchen 3 miles away smells of roasting meat and imported pepper, a spice worth more than silver. The distance between that kitchen and this one is not just 3 miles. It is an entire world. This is the story of what most medieval Europeans actually ate. Not the feasts, not the banquets, the real food, the daily food, the food that history almost forgot to write down. We assume the past tasted like the present. We imagine medieval kitchens smelling of herbs and spice, of roasting and seasoning. We picture hearty stews, thick breads, robust flavors. We have seen the paintings. We have watched the films. But here is the truth. For the vast majority of medieval Europeans, the farmers, the laborers, the peasants who made up nearly 90% of the population, food had almost no flavor at all. Salt was taxed and rationed. Sugar was a medicine, locked in apothecary cabinets. Spices like pepper and cinnamon were so expensive that a single pound of black pepper could buy a man's freedom from serfdom. So what did they actually eat? How did they survive, and in some cases thrive, on a diet that modern people would find almost unrecognizable? The answer is stranger, more ingenious, and more human than you might expect. To understand medieval European food, you have to understand the medieval European world. Between roughly 500 AD and 1400 AD, Europe was a continent of extreme inequality layered over a foundation of agricultural survival. The Roman trade networks that had once moved olive oil, wine, and garum, a fermented fish sauce used to season almost everything, had collapsed. What replaced them was a patchwork of local economies, feudal land systems, and seasonal scarcity. For the peasant class, which included serfs, villeins, cottagers, and free farmers across England, France, Germany, and beyond, life was organized almost entirely around the agricultural calendar. You planted in spring, you prayed through summer, you harvested in autumn, and in winter you ate whatever you had managed to preserve from the months before. The church shaped the food calendar as much as the seasons did. Fasting days, days when meat was forbidden, made up nearly a third of the entire year. Lent alone was 40 days of no meat, no eggs, no dairy. On those days, the peasants' already sparse diet became sparser still. Salt was not simply a seasoning in this world. It was infrastructure. Without refrigeration, salt was the only reliable way to preserve meat, fish, and vegetables through the long winter months. But salt was expensive. In many regions it was taxed directly by the crown or the local lord. Poor families used it sparingly, if at all, saving it almost entirely for preservation rather than flavor. Sugar existed in medieval Europe, but barely. It arrived through Arab trade routes as a luxury product, classified officially as a spice, and sold by apothecaries as medicine. A teaspoon of sugar cost the equivalent of several hours of labor. Honey was the only sweetener available to common people, and even that was carefully hoarded. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, came from Asia and the Middle East through expensive and dangerous overland trade routes. By the time they reached a London market, their price had been multiplied dozens of times over. Pepper was so valuable that it was sometimes used to pay rent. A medieval English laborer earning a penny a day would have needed to work several days to afford a single ounce of black pepper. This was the world the medieval peasant cooked in. No seasoning to speak of, no preserved flavor, just fire, water, grain, and whatever the land around them produced. The foundation of the medieval peasant diet was pottage, and if you have never heard of it, that is precisely the point. Pottage was not a recipe. It was a category, a method, a way of using whatever existed to produce something that could sustain a working body through a day of physical labor. At its most basic, pottage was grain boiled in water until thick. Oats in England and Northern Europe, barley or rye where oats would not grow, spelt in parts of Germany and France. The grain was not ground into fine flour that was expensive and labor-intensive. It was cracked or roughly milled, added to a pot of water over a fire, and cooked until it became a thick, heavy paste. Into this base went whatever was available. In summer and early autumn, leeks, onions, cabbage, turnips, peas, beans. In winter, dried pulses, salted vegetables if the family had been lucky enough to preserve some, root vegetables pulled from cold storage. Occasionally a small piece of salt pork or bacon fat, used not as a main ingredient but as a flavoring agent, a single strip of fat stirred through the pot to give the gray porridge some trace of richness. Bread accompanied every meal that could afford it, but medieval peasant bread was nothing like the soft, white loaves we know today. It was dense, dark, and heavy, made from rye, barley, or mixed grain flour that had not been finely milled. It was often sour from natural fermentation because commercial yeast did not exist. Stale bread was not thrown away. It was soaked in liquid, added to pottage, or used as a trencher, a thick flat slab that served as both plate and food, soaked through with whatever it had been holding by the end of a meal. The flavor of all of this by modern standards would have been almost non-existent, slightly earthy from the grain, faintly bitter from the cabbage or leeks, occasionally smoky from the fire, nothing more. The medieval peasant kitchen was, in most cases, a single room. The fire was the center of everything, not a contained fireplace in the modern sense, but an open hearth on the floor or a raised stone platform in the middle of the room. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, or did not escape at all, drifting through the rafters and slowly curring the thatch and timber above. Walls and ceilings in peasant homes were perpetually stained black with smoke. Respiratory illness was common and widely accepted as simply the cost of staying warm. Over this fire hung the pot, usually iron, if the family was fortunate, or clay if they were not. Iron pots were valuable enough to be listed in wills and passed down through generations. The pot rarely came off the fire. A batch of pottage might cook for hours, cooling overnight and reheating the next morning with fresh additions thrown in. Some households maintained what was essentially a continuous pottage, a pot that was never fully emptied, only added to, running for days or even weeks at a time. Water came from a well or a stream carried by hand. It was not considered safe to drink on its own, not because medieval people understood germ theory, but because experience had taught them that river water made people ill. Instead, they drank ale, thin, low-alcohol ale brewed from malted barley and water, which the fermentation process made safer to consume. Even children drank it. Even breakfast included it. This was not indulgence. It was survival. Bread making happened on a cycle. Most peasant families did not own an oven. Ovens required significant construction and fuel. Instead, grain was taken to the Lord's mill to be ground, then to the communal village oven to be baked, with a portion of the flour or bread taken as payment by the Lord. This system, called the banquets in France, meant that even the act of making bread was subject to feudal taxation. Wild ingredients supplemented the domestic ones when the season allowed. Mushrooms, berries, nettles, watercress, elderflowers, hazelnuts, all gathered by hand from the forests and hedgerows that bordered the fields. These were not delicacies. They were necessity. They were also, ironically, some of the only genuinely flavorful elements in an otherwise bland diet. Food in medieval Europe was not just sustenance. It was a social map. What you ate announced exactly who you were and where you stood in the rigid hierarchy of feudal society. The sumptuary laws of medieval England and France, actual legislation governing what different classes were permitted to eat, formalized this distinction in writing. Venison, swan, peacock, and imported spices were legally restricted to the nobility in certain periods. Eating above your station was not just socially inappropriate, it could be a punishable offense. This made feasting at a lord's table an act of profound political theater. When a medieval nobleman served roasted boar seasoned with pepper and ginger at a banquet, he was not simply feeding his guests. He was demonstrating his power, his trade connections, his wealth, and his status in a single meal. The spices on his table had traveled thousands of miles. His guests understood exactly what that meant. For the peasant watching from the field outside, food carried a different kind of meaning entirely. One organized around survival, community, and the rhythm of the church calendar. The communal feast days that punctuated the medieval year, Michaelmas, Christmas, Easter, Midsummer, were the moments when the monotony briefly broke. A pig might be slaughtered. Ale might be brewed in larger quantities. Women might bake sweet pastries using the precious household honey. These were not small occasions. For people who ate gray porridge 3 times a day for months at a time, a feast day with roasted meat and sweetened bread was a profound and deeply felt experience. Food was also medicine. Without access to apothecaries or physicians, medieval peasants used what grew around them to treat illness: garlic for infection, ginger root, when they could afford it, for stomach ailments, nettles boiled into tea for joint pain. The line between kitchen and pharmacy in the medieval world was essentially non-existent. The medieval peasant diet began its slow transformation in the late 14th and 15th centuries, pushed by a confluence of forces that permanently changed what Europeans ate. The Black Death, which killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351, paradoxically improved the diet of those who survived. With fewer laborers available, surviving peasants gained bargaining power they had never held before. Wages rose. Land became available. The rigid feudal restrictions on food began to loosen. Then came the age of exploration. Portuguese and Spanish ships returning from the Americas brought back ingredients that would permanently alter European cooking: tomatoes, potatoes, chilies, maize, chocolate, vanilla. The potato alone, introduced to Europe in the late 1500s, would eventually become the primary food source for millions of people across Ireland, Germany, and Eastern Europe, replacing the grain-based pottage culture that had dominated for 1,000 years. The spice trade, which had kept pepper and cinnamon locked behind prohibitive prices for centuries, began to democratize as European powers established direct sea routes to Asia. Prices fell. By the 1600s, spices that had once been the exclusive privilege of the nobility were appearing in middle-class and eventually working-class kitchens. Pottage did not disappear overnight. In remote rural areas of England, Scotland, and Ireland, it remained a daily staple well into the 1700s and in some regions beyond. But the world that had made it necessary, a world without affordable salt, without accessible spice, without sugar outside a physician's cabinet, was slowly dissolving. There is something worth sitting within this story. We live in an age where flavor is everywhere, where a single grocery store contains spices from 40 countries, where sugar is an ingredient in bread, where salt is so cheap it is given away free. We have so thoroughly solved the problem of bland food that we have invented entire movements dedicated to removing the things our ancestors spent their lives trying to obtain. The medieval peasant stirring a pot of gray oat porridge over a smoky hearth was not living a lesser life. They were living the only life available, with extraordinary ingenuity, with deep communal bonds, and with a relationship to food that was honest in a way ours rarely is. They knew exactly where every ingredient came from. They knew the cost of every grain of salt. They understood in their bones what it meant for food to be scarce. The next time you reach for the salt without thinking, remember that for most of human history, that single gesture was a luxury beyond the reach of millions.